Hello, and welcome to another lecture on theories of personality. For today's lecture, we will be discussing Carl Jung's analytical psychology. This will be the outline for this lecture video. First, we will discuss the levels of the psyche, followed by dynamics of personality, psychological types, and lastly, development of personality. This lecture video will be divided into two parts. So for this one, we would only discuss the levels of the psyche and the dynamics of personality. The psyche, just like Sigmund Freud, Jung believed that it is composed of two levels, which is the conscious level and the unconscious level. Later on, we will discuss that the unconscious level will be divided into two more parts, which is the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. In contrast with Freud, Jung believed that the unconscious part is the center of the personality system, which means that psychological health is attained by having the collective unconscious as the center of one's personality system. First on the levels of the psyche is the conscious level. So this level contains images that are sensed by one's ego. And because this is in the conscious level, it has no relationship with the unconscious elements. Now, how Jung conceptualized the conscious level is basically similar to how Freud also conceptualized conscious levels. However, we need to understand the major distinction between Freud and Jung's concept on the ego. The major distinction has to do something with the role of the ego in the personality system. For Freud, the ego is the center of the personality system. And so, in order for an individual to attain psychological health, the ego should be able to control the impulses of the id as well as the demands of the superego. And so, that is the characteristics of an individual with a healthy personality system. Jung, however, disagreed with this notion. For Jung, ego should only be secondary to the unconscious elements because the collective unconscious in specific should be at the center of the personality system. An overemphasis on expanding one's conscious psyche can lead to psychological imbalance. Now, if there's one word that we want to associate Carl Jung's theory, it is the word balance. We would understand later that in order for an individual to attain psychological health, aside from allowing the unconscious level be at the center of the personality system, the other components of the personality must also be balanced. So, psychological health has to do something with balancing the different components of the personality system. The second on the list is the personal unconscious, and this is the level where all repressed, forgotten, or subliminally perceived experiences are contained. Now, the name suggests personal unconscious has something to do with the uniqueness of its contents because this contain personal or individual experiences that are repressed, forgotten because of time. Now, some images can be recalled easily, or it could be remembered with difficulty, and some contents in this level are beyond the reach of consciousness. Aside from this concept on the personal and conscious, one concept that we need to understand is on the concept. A concept that we need to understand in the personal and conscious is the concept on complexes. Now, complexes, as defined with the book, Feist and Feist, are emotionally toned conglomeration of associated ideas that are partly derived from humanity's collective experience or conscious image. Now, take note, complexes are primarily derived from the contents of the personal unconscious. However, some parts of it can also be derived from the collective unconscious or even one's conscious images. Now, this concept may be difficult to understand So to put this simply, think of the concept of a library. So when you go to a library, you can find a lot of books, and usually they are organized into sections wherein books are grouped together based on similar content. So for example, if you want to read books about mystery, you would find novels about mystery under the section mystery. Or if you want to read about love, you would have to find books under romance. So same goes with the complex. So complexes are basically a compilation of personal experiences, experiences that are repressed or forgotten. And because they have similar contents, they tend to be crystallized and grouped together to form complexes. So for instance, your personal experiences with dogs may be repressed or forgotten over time. Repeated personal experiences with a dog that are repressed or forgotten can be compiled or be grouped together so that they would form a dog complex. Or maybe your experiences with women. Let's say, for example, for the rest of your life, you have encountered women, and so those forgotten or repressed experiences or similar experiences with women may be clumped or may be grouped together that would form the women complex. And so basically, you can think of your personal unconscious as your own mini library with its own complexes inside it. So you may have your dog complexes, which is basically a compilation of contents about dogs, or women complex, which are all basically repressed and forgotten materials about your experiences with women. Now, take note that these concepts or complexes are emotionally toned, and so these compilations basically of experiences can evoke an emotion. So, for example, a dog complex may evoke happiness or joy, while women complex may evoke maybe love, comfort, or fertility. So it actually depends on one's experiences. And because these are contents found in the personal unconscious, complexes are highly individualized. That means that even if two people have dog complexes, the contents of their own complexes are highly individualized and so significantly different from each other. And the last on the list is the collective unconscious. So according to Jung, this should be the center of the personality system. So from the term itself, collective, it has something to do with a compilation, similar with the complexes earlier. Now, collective unconscious are derived from roots in our ancestral past of the entire species, and Jung would even say that the experiences of our pre-human ancestors are still actually compiled. Now, the collective unconscious contain physical contents of the collective unconscious that are inherited. That means when you were born, you already have this material or genetic material, and they are inherited as a psychic potential. Now, take note, this is one distinction between the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious. So, personal unconscious are repressed or forgotten materials from individual or personal experiences. So, that means the contents of the personal unconscious of person A is very different from that of the contents of person B's personal unconscious. However, because collective unconsciousness has something to do with a compilation of our ancestors' experiences in the past, so more or less we have the same contents in our collective unconscious. So more or less the same for people in all cultures. Now, the contents of the collective unconscious may seem dormant, but they're actually active, and they can influence our thoughts, emotions, and our actions. Now, the collective unconscious does not refer to inherited ideas, but actually it refers to humans' innate tendency to react in a particular way whenever their experiences stimulate a biological inherited response tendency. So I would like to highlight the word innate tendency to react in a particular way. Now, a concept that we will discuss after this is the concept on archetypes. So archetypes are contents that we can find in the collective unconscious. And so the contents of the collective unconscious and consciousness basically has to do something with repeated experiences of our ancestors. And because it's been repeated for generations and generations and generations, they tend to crystallize and becomes a inherited material. And because of that inherited material, we inherit in an innate tendency to react in a particular way. For an example, our ancestors have experienced darkness over and over and over again. Now, because of their experiences with darkness over and over and over again, we can inherit an innate tendency on how we can react to darkness in a particular way. And so this would explain why we, even as we're kids, even if we're not taught to be scared in darkness, we have this innate tendency to be scared of darkness because this is also a similar reaction that our ancestors have experienced in the past, and it's been repeated and repeated again and again that it was imprinted into our genes. Earlier, I mentioned about the concept of the archetypes. Now, the collective unconscious, it does contain materials or contents from our ancestral past. However, not all of the contents are elevated to a level of the archetypes. And so not all repeated experiences of our ancestors become crystallized and become archetypes. So archetypes are an ancient or archaic image that derive from the collective unconscious. So again, this may be similar to complexes wherein they are repressed contents. However, they differ in contents because again, complexes are individualized components of personal unconscious, but for archetypes, they are generalized because again, they are derived from our roots or our ancestors. Because archetypes are found in the collective unconscious, and so therefore it is in the unconscious level, it cannot be directly represented by an individual. However, when it is activated, so this is again only activated when a certain experience or a certain event stimulates this biological component. And it can be expressed through primarily dreams, fantasies, and delusions. Another major distinction between Freud and Jung on their concept on phylogenetic endowment, or for Jung, the collective unconscious, is that for Jung, the explanation of one's behavior is largely attributed to the collective unconscious. And so again, Jung emphasized the role of the archetypes, which is found in the collective unconscious, and it is primarily the reason why individuals behave in such ways. However, for Freud, the concept of the phylogenetic endowment is only used as a last resort, and so it's not the primary explanation as to why people are motivated to behave, think in certain ways. Now let's talk about the different archetypes as Jung mentioned in his theory. So the first one is the archetype persona, which is the side of personality that people show to the world. So it has something to do with projecting the role that we need to play in the society. So as individuals, there are specific roles that society dictates. So this could be a role of a teacher, a role of a student, a role of a president, and things like that. Now, although persona is a necessary side. So again, this guides us on how we should behave in society because it is our tendencies to play a role. Now, it is useful because It enables us to behave in civilized manners. It enables us to follow the rules of society, such as being dressed in public so you wouldn't be naked, and other rules that the society imposes onto us. However, we should not be confused about the role of persona in relation to the complete self. So we need to understand that persona is only one of the components of the complete psyche or the complete personality system. And so Jung believed that if we identify closely with our persona, so we remain unconscious of our individuality and are blocked from attaining self realization. And so, again, the goal for Jung's theory is to achieve balance, so balance of the different components within the personality system. And so, when an individual is able to balance all of the components of the collective unconscious, personal unconscious, and the conscious levels, we would attain a state of self realization. So if we identify closely with the persona, again, highlighting the roles, your roles to play in a society, and so you will not be able to attain self realization because, again, balance will not be achieved. It is true that we must acknowledge society, so we also need to play the role we have in the society to be civil, to maintain a harmonious, um, relationship with the people in the society. However, if we over identify with our persona, we lose touch of our inner self and remain dependent on society's expectations of us. And so, to become psychologically healthy, Jung believed that we must strike a balance between the demands of society and what we truly are. So again, the word there is balance, because again, other parts of the collective unconscious also contributes to the balance, no, to one's personality system. So not just the persona. The next archetype is the archetype of the shadow. So the archetype, this is the archetype of darkness and repression. So this is the archetype where which is something that most people are very afraid to show, because again it refers to darkness and repression. So this represents those qualities we do not wish to acknowledge, how and attempt to hide from ourselves and others. So again, in a way, it has its negative connotation. So this consists of morally objectionable tendencies, but aside from that, it also has its constructive and creative qualities that we are reluctant to face. And so, even if this consists of morally objectionable tendencies, this would also give color to your personality, as this is also consisted of creative and constructive qualities. And so, again, this would bring color to the personality system of an individual. If the shadow is totally suppressed, the psyche will be dull and lifeless, again, because it has its creativity in a component. It is the ego's function to repress the animal instincts enough so that we are considered civilized. But we should still allow sufficient expression to provide creativity and vigor. If we would suppress, these creativity and vigor, it will imbalance the system, and our psyche will become dull and lifeless. So if the shadow is fully repressed, so it may revolt. So again, that's not also healthy for an individual psychological health. Now, the first test of courage, according to Jung, is to know our shadow, be comfortable with our creative and constructive qualities, as well as the other tendencies that we are afraid to show in the society. And so, if we are able to confront them and be comfortable about this side, then we can achieve balance in our personality system. The next archetype is the archetype anima. So, like Freud, Jung believed that all humans are psychologically bisexual. So, we have our masculine and feminine side. So, the archetype anima is the innate potential of men to behave, or tendencies to behave in a way to be feminine. So, this is the feminine side of men. So this contributes to the emotional instability of men sometimes, or the moodiness of men, at least according to Jung. So this is the feminine side of men, and it remains extremely resistant to consciousness. So the anima is the second test of courage for men, at least for men. So gaining acceptance of one's anima. It means recognizing one's anima happens after only when one is comfortable with one's shadow. So first, we need to be comfortable with our um, seemingly objectionable tendencies, but also constructive and creative qualities. And then once we are able to do that, we will also have now the courage to accept, the feminine side for men and the masculine side for women. So the anima originated from early men's experiences with women. Next is the animus. So this is the masculine archetype in women. So if the anima is the innate potentiality of men to behave in irrational ways, no, with irrational moods and feelings, animus is the female's tendency to also think and reason. Again, that is according to Jung. No? So according to him, it is allows the individual to be capable, or the animus is capable of influencing the thinking of a woman, but it does not actually belong to the woman. So Jung would even say that the reason why women has tendency to think and reason is because of the inherited innate potential from our ancestors. And so I'm not really sure how would women take this concept, no, about the animus. Next is the Great Mother archetype. So the Great Mother is a pre-existing concept of a mother associated with both positive and negative feelings. So if you can see, almost all of the concepts of Jung really have, um, it has, two poles. For example, the Great Mother both has positive and negative feelings. So the Great Mother archetype represents two opposing forces of fertility and nourishment, and to power and destruction. So it can be our potential to be nourishing, but it could also be our potential to be destructive and powerful. Next is the archetype wise old man. So again, this may mean wisdom and meaning. So again, take note, this is coming from the repeated experiences of our ancestors. And so if an individual overemphasizes, no, about on the wise old man archetype, so the person may seemingly be wisdom on the outside, and the person may seem very intellectual, but if you would look closely, over identifying with the wise old man archetype would actually mean that yes, you would sound intellectual and may even be able to convince a group of people, but then your words are actually empty. And so this is influenced by Jung's own father. Okay, so it symbolizes humans' pre-existing knowledge of the mysteries of life. And you also have the hero archetype. So this is represented in mythology and legends as a powerful person. So hero, according to Jung, is often undone by seemingly insignificant person or event. For example, Achilles, his weakness is the heel, right? For Superman, kryptonite. So heroic deeds can only be performed by some who is vulnerable or who has a weakness. So if an individual doesn't have a weakness, then therefore he cannot be a hero. Because again, for Jung, heroic deeds can only for those people with vulnerability. So again, take note that archetypes are our innate potential to react in a particular situation if a situation would stimulate or trigger these archetypes. And so this may explain why people would be involved in heroic deeds when there are situations that requires them to do so, like maybe in calamities or whatsoever. And lastly, the archetype of the self. So Jung conceptualized the self as the archetypes among archetypes. So the archetype of archetype. So this is our inherited innate tendency to move toward growth, perfection, and completion. And this archetype serves as the enzyme, in chemistry, that would allow the individual to balance the other components in the system. So it pulls together other archetypes and unites them in self realization. So take note, the self is different from self realization. So the self is the archetype that would pull the other archetypes together so they will be united. So then, if it's united, they will attain a state of self realization, which is a state of a balance or harmonious components in the personality system. Okay? So I hope that's clear. So the self is symbolized by a person's ideas of perfection, completion, and wholeness, or the mandala. So it represents strivings of the collective unconscious for unity, balance, and wholeness. So again, that's the representation of the self. Now, don't be confused between self and the ego. Self is an archetype found in the collective unconscious, while the ego is the conscious component of personality. So again, I hope you would not be able to, or you would not be confused between the two concepts. So although the self is almost never perfectly balanced, each person has in the collective unconscious a concept of the perfect and unified self. So how can an individual fully actualize the self, or gain a state of balance? So to actualize or fully experience the self, the individual must have or possess these characteristics. Number one, people must overcome their fear of the unconscious, prevent their persona from dominating their personality, recognize the dark side of themselves, which is the shadow, and then muster even greater courage to face their anima or animus. Unless these things are achieved, then we could never fully actualize or experience the self. Again, the word for Jung's theory is balance. So a balanced personality system would look like this. So again, Jung, in contrast to Freud, emphasize the major role of the unconscious, especially on the collective unconscious. So, in a balanced psyche or personality system, the collective unconscious is on the middle. So, you have there in the middle the persona, animus, shadow, anima, balanced. And then the outer part of the circle, you have your personal unconscious, and on the outermost part of the circle is the conscious or the ego. So again, this is how a balanced personality looks like. Now let's talk about the dynamics of personality. What could be other assumptions in Jung's theory? So for Jung, is a is human behavior motivated from the past, just like Freud, or is it motivated by one's goals in the future, just like Adler? For Jung, it's actually a balance of both. So it is both influenced. Behavior is both influenced by causality, which are past causes, and teleology, which are your goals or future hopes. Okay. Now let's also talk about progression and regression. So to achieve self-realization, we must be able to adapt. Again, there's balance. So we need to adapt to the outside environment, which is progression, but we also have times for our inner selves, and we also need to adapt to our inner world as well, so which is regression. Now again, so we must adapt in our outside environment as well as our inner world. So again, that's progression and regression. So progression in specifically has to do with the adaptation to the outside world. That involves the forward flow of psychic energy, while regression is the adaptation to the inner world that involves on a backward flow of psychic energy. So again, there is also balance between the outside and the inner world of an individual. So let's talk more about the psychic energy. So again, psychic energy is one of the central concepts that we need to understand in Jung's theory. No? So similar to Freud's theory as well. Now, one of the first points on which Jung differed from Freud or Jung disagreed with Freud is on the nature of libido. So for Jung, he disagreed with Freud that libido was primarily a sexual energy. So again, if you recall Freud's theory, diba, libido has something to do, which is the psychic energy form of the life instinct, right? But for Jung, he argued that libido is not necessarily sexual in nature, but it is primarily a broad and undifferentiated life energy. And so the psychic energy class or the libido is very important because again, it allows us um, to operate, or it allows us to do psychological activities, which we will discuss further. Now, this is just a fun fact between Jung and Freud and their concepts on the libido. No? So again, the libido may be related to Jung and Freud's sex lives. Now, for Jung, he disputed Freud's claim that, again, libido is primarily sexual energy. So he minimized the role of the sexual energy to play in the personality. However, in reality, Jung actually enjoyed his sex life, which can be seen with his multiple extramarital relationships. For Freud, on the other hand, which he emphasized the primary role of the sexual drives, the life instinct or the sexual energy, as a primary motivator of an individual. Freud actually lived with a frustrated sexual life, and so it's just quite ironic, no, for these two men and their own concepts about the libido. Okay, so Jung used the term libido in two ways. So first, he described it as a diffuse and general life energy. Okay, and second, um, he defined libido from a perspective similar to Freud, which is a narrower psychic energy that fuels the work of personality. So again, psychic energy is important because it fuels one's personality. So how we are able to um, do or operate mga psychological activities such as thinking, feeling, it's actually because of psychic energy, because of libido. So Jung coined the term psyche as personality. So it's Jung's term for personality. Now again, it is through psychic energy that fuels activities such as perceiving, thinking, feeling, and wishing that we do on a daily. Okay, so what do we need to know more about a psychic energy? So again, a person, because it's an energy, a person can invest a great portion of your energy in any psychological activity, maybe in thinking and feeling and whatsoever. So when a person invests the psychic energy, not the specific need or specific thing, it is said to have a high psychic value. That means it's important in your life and it can strongly influence the person's life. So, what do I mean by that? So, let's say, for example, an individual who is highly motivated to achieve power or maybe to attain achievement maybe in work or in school in your, let's say, course. So that means you are actually investing a lot of that libido, a lot of that psychic energy in attaining power and achievements, and so you will have a lot of energy in behaving in ways that will enable you to achieve power, maybe power in the politics or whatsoever, or achievement maybe at work or in school, in your course, maybe now as a psychology student. Now, again, take note, this is how Jung used the term libido. So, it is used in two ways: diffuse and general life energy. And in the psyche, it is used as a narrower psychic energy that, again, fuels an individual or fuel psychological activities. And an individual can actually invest, no, different portions of the psychic energy depending on which is important or whatsoever for the individual. Now, the concept of Jung about the psychic energy is actually governed or follows three basic principles. So there are three. We have the principles of the opposites, principles of equivalence, and the principle of entropy. So let's discuss them one by one. So let's first discuss about the principle of opposites. Now, the principle of opposites can actually be seen throughout Jung's system, and you may have noticed by now that for each concept, diba, there are opposing qualities. For example, on Jung's concept, or Jung believed that individuals are naturally bisexual in nature. No? So males have anima, females have animus. No? So what else? So if you remember the qualities of the great mother archetype, you can see both opposing qualities. No? For one, the great mother archetype could represent nurturance, fertility, growth. But on the other side, the great mother archetype could also be a symbol of power and destruction, or a tendency to attain power and destroy things. No? What else? So another good example is the shadow archetype. So the shadow archetype may have the quality of something that is undesirable, something that we're not comfortable showing to society. However, on the other side of this quality is actually a quality of creativity. No? So it gives life and color to one's personality system. And so this concept is actually seen throughout Jung's theory. And again, with the previous slides, we learned a way of achieving psychological health is balancing these opposites. Okay, so again, Jung noted the existence of opposites or polarities. So this is similar to physics, physical energy. For example, there heat versus cold, height versus depth, and whatsoever. So according to this principle of opposites, so with psychic energy, every wish or feeling has its opposite. So again, there is a conflict between two opposing polarities. And why is it important for us to understand that there are two conflicting polarities? Because it is because of the conflict between two opposing qualities baka, or two opposing things that actually generates energy. So, diba, it generates energy. So, the sharper, the greater the conflict between polarities, the greater the energy produced. So, it's necessary for our psyche or our personality. Again, take note, it is the conflict of two opposing qualities baka, or polarities that are generating the energy. Okay, so that's for the principle of opposites. How about for the next principle, which is the principle of equivalence? Now, for this principle, there are actually two concepts that we need to understand. So the first concept that we need to understand for this principle is the concept on conversation. Now, you may have noticed by now that the concepts that Jung used here are borrowed from that of the physical science or physics. No? So, what do you mean by the concept on conservation on this principle of equivalence? So, Jung applied to psychic events the physical principle of the conservation of energy. This basically means that when you spend an energy, no? Or energy, when energy is expended in bringing about some condition, it is not actually lost, but rather shifted to another part of the personality. So same goes with science. Energy can actually be transformed into different forms of energy. So for example, when you make this machine work through mechanical energy, the mechanical energy that you use is not actually entirely lost, but it is transformed into another form of energy, maybe in chemical energy or heat or whatsoever. So basically the same with the concept of the psychic energy and its principle of conservation, a concept in the principle of equivalence. So going back, just like in physics, no, the energy is not lost. No, it is actually transformed into a different form of energy. Thus, it is conserved. So in psychic terms, or in the field of psychology or in personality, so if the psychic value in a particular area weakens or disappears through time, the energy there is not actually gone, but it is transferred somewhere else in the personality system or one's psyche. So a really good example is when we lose interest of a particular something. Let's say, for example, when you were younger, you used to take interest in, let's say, painting. Okay, so you used to do landscape painting and whatsoever. Eventually, as you grow older, you lost the interest of painting, and for some reason you began joining football. For example, you not into arts anymore, and then you now into sports. So um, going back to the principle of equivalence or conservation, so the psychic energy that you have invested, no, in arts or in painting when you were younger is not actually lost, but it is redistributed and transformed into a newer form of psychic energy invested in a new interest, which is football. No? So if we lose interest in a person, maybe saying uyab, unta dili, a hobby or a field of study, so it is just invested in or shifted to a new one. So again, it is not lost, but it is transformed and is manifested in other forms of interest, hobby, or whatsoever. Okay, so that's the concept on conservation. The second concept, which is related to the concept on conservation, is the concept on equivalence, thus, the principle of equivalence. So, again, psychic energy is not lost, it is conserved and transformed in other forms. So, what is the concept now on equivalence? So, this implies, class, nga even if the energy is transformed into something else, that new thing is equivalent to the former thing. So, for example, if your levels of energy or interest for arts is, let's say, at this specific, no, very high, let's say very high, your interest is very high in um, painting. So when you eventually lose the interest, no, and you're now interested with football, it's actually equivalent. No, the level of energy or interest is equivalent to that of painting when you were younger. So the concept of equivalence implies that the new area to which energy has shifted must have an equal psychic value. So it should be equally desirable or interesting or fascinating for you. A great interest in gardening must be equally interesting to your new hobby, maybe hiking. So that's the concept on equivalence. Now let's go on the third and last principle, which is the principle on entropy. And entropy has something to do with equalization. Again, balance, equilibrium, something that is characteristic of Jung's theory. So it refers to the equalization of energy differences. No, in a way, I would relate this to a different subject. So this is a really good example when you to understand this principle. So I want you to I will bring you back to your physiological psychology class, no? Especially on the concepts on action potentials, diba? If you remember, action potentials basically has to do something with the different concentration gradients of ions, right? For sodium ions and for potassium ions. If you still remember, there are different concentration gradients, no? Differences in their concentrations inside and outside the neuron. An action potential actually occurs when there is a what? Equalization of concentration. So, for example, if you still remember, that ions or sodium or potassium ions would actually flow from a more concentrated area to a less concentrated area. For example, when sodium channels open, sodium ions from the outside of the cell, because they are more concentrated, would flow into the cell because inside the cell there is less concentrated sodium ions. Okay, so this is basically the principle of entropy, no? Equalization of energy differences. Another example, if a hot object and a cold object are placed, in direct contact, so heat will flow from the hotter object towards the colder object until they are in equilibrium. Okay, until they would reach the same temperature. So again, an exchange, basically the principle of entropy, in effect, is an exchange of energy occurs so that homeostasis or equilibrium can be attained. And so this is a quality or a characteristic of a psychologically healthy personality where opposing qualities tend to be balanced. Okay, so this may also explain why a highly extroverted person tends to move towards introversion as time passes. Because again, according to a principle of entropy, there will be an equal distribution of psychic energy in the structures of personality. However, class, no, um, even if it's ideal for two opposing um, qualities, no, one is highly concentrated, the other one is less concentrated to really balance, no. However, this ideal state is almost never achieved because if perfect balance or equilibrium were attained, then personality would have no psychic energy. Why? Because it is only through the opposition of or the conflicts of two opposites that where energy is generated, and so it has to be maintained or else there's no psychic energy. So even if it's ideal, it's never achieved, at least according to Hume. And this concludes the first part of the discussion. So if you want to grasp more of the concepts, you may stop at this part. So you could go back to the previous discussions about the concepts on analytical psychology. For the next parts of the discussion, we will discuss about psychological types. Now, according to Jung, class, so much of our conscious perception of and how we react to the stimuli in our environment is actually determined by two opposing mental attitudes called extroversion and introversion. So you may ask, what is a mental attitude and why is it important? So mental attitude, as how Jung defined it, it is our predisposition to act or react in a characteristic direction. So a mental attitude actually um, it implies direction on where we should channel our psychic energy, and we can or individuals can channel psychic energy either externally or internally. So again, it would matter where we direct our psychic energy, because again, psychic energy is used to perform psychological activities. So again, there are two mental attitudes, and the first one is introversion. So introversion has to do something with turning inward of psychic energy with an orientation toward the subjective. So here again, mental attitude refers to a direction of channeling a psychic energy. And so introverted people, they channel their psychic energy towards the inner world. And so introverts are turned into the inner world with all its biases, fantasies, dreams, and individualized perception. So you may say that psychic energy is invested largely to the subjective experiences of biases, fantasies, etc., etc. Extroversion, on the other hand, is an attitude distinguished by the turning outward of psychic energy to that a person is oriented toward the objective and away from the subjective. So now psychic energy is channeled outside the inner self or the inner world. And so extroverts are more influenced by their surroundings than by their inner world. Now, according to Jung, everyone has the capacity for both attitudes. So we both have the opposing poles of extroversion and introversion. However, only one becomes dominant in the psyche or in the personality. So the dominant attitude, whether extroversion or introversion, tends to direct the person's behavior and consciousness. So most of the times, you would behave in a way that is consistent with your dominant nga mental attitude. But it doesn't mean that the non-dominant attitude remains dormant. It actually is still influential. However, it becomes part of the personal unconscious, which can still still affect behavior. So this may explain why in some situations an introverted person, characterized by own subjective biases, fantasies, can display characteristics of an extroverted person. So the person can still be outgoing or can wish to be more outgoing or be attracted to an extrovert. So that's the concept of Jung. Another concept that we need to understand is on the concepts on psychological functions. So again, this is an additional distinctions among people. So again, people can be distinguished based on their um, mental attitude, and furthermore, they can also be distinguished based on their psychological functions. Okay, so a function refers to different and opposing ways of perceiving or apprehending both the external real world and our subjective inner world. And Jung believed that, again, everyone has the capacity for all four psychological functions. Again, functions refer to different and opposing ways of perceiving or apprehending, understanding both our external real world and subjective inner world. Now, the four psychological functions are grouped into two major categories. The first one are non-rational functions, and the other one are rational functions. So, sensing and intuiting are called non-rational functions. They're called non-rational functions because they do not use the process of reasoning or reason, and these functions basically just accept experiences but do not evaluate them. So, for example, sensing is to do something with our sensations. So, when the person is sensing, the person just basically reproduce an experience through our senses: your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your ears, so through auditory senses. But again, there is no reasoning involved. You just basically reproduce the experience based on your senses. Intuition is more on the belief that is based on a hunch rather than through our senses. And still, it is not based on the process of reasoning. So they're called non-rational functions. On the other hand, the two other remaining functions, the thinking and feeling dichotomy, are called rational functions. Now, rational functions because they involve making judgments and evaluations about experiences. So, unlike sensations or sensing and intuition, which does not involve reasoning or processing, rational functions such as thinking and feeling involves judgments. So both of them are rational functions because they are concerned with organizing and categorizing experiences. So for example, the thinking function involves a conscious judgment whether an experience, a situation, a thing is true or false, right or wrong. So again, there is judgment. Feeling, on the other hand, or the feeling function, is expressed in terms such as fun or boring, pleasant or unpleasant. Um, I like it, I don't like it. So again, there is a value attached to a specific experience or a specific object. Baka. So again, they are involved in judgments and evaluations. So again, they are called the rational functions. So again, let's proceed. So for sensing, it has something to do with the function of the sensation or receiving of physical stimuli and transmits them to perceptual consciousness. So sensing is an individual's perception of sensory impulses. Intuition, on the other hand, so this is just a more in-depth definition of each functions. So intuition involves perception beyond the workings of consciousness. It differs from sensing because it is more creative. It does not necessarily is not tied to the sensory information that we receive from our sense organs, and it often adds or subtract elements from conscious sensations. For example, diba, in Filipino we call it kutob, right? So it's not primarily based on the things that you gather from senses, right? But it's just based from your hunch, no, kutob. Next is the function of thinking, which is in a logical intellectual activity that produces a chain of ideas. And thinking involves conscious judgment of whether an experience is true or whether it's false. Thinking, on the other hand, is attaching value to every conscious activity, whether your date was something pleasant, was it boring, whether your vacation to a specific area, specific place was fun or was it dull? Did you like the food that you eat or did you not like the taste of the food that you eat? And things like that. So again, it can come or it can be expressed in terms of like, dislike, pleasant, or unpleasant. One thing that we need to understand about the four functions. Now again, these four functions are used to distinguish individuals. So four functions actually approach a hierarchy. So only one of the function occupies the superior position. The other function assumes the secondary position while the other two becomes inferior or become two inferior positions. Now, for most people, according to Jung, we only cultivate only one function. So therefore, only one function dominates our personality. Some people may develop two functions, while very, very few mature individuals have cultivated three. And so the more functions that you will be able to cultivate, to master, the more psychologically healthy you are, according to Jung, because again, it has something to do with the balance of these four functions. Again, balance is something that we can attribute to Jung's theory. So, a person who has theoretically achieved self realization or individuation would have all four functions highly developed. And so, again, if you still remember, the state of self-realization can only be achieved when all of the elements of the psyche or the personality system attains balance. Okay. So from the mental attitudes and the psychological functions, we can create 8 psychological types, based on the interactions of one's mental attitudes, the direction of channeling our psychic energy, whether on the external world or towards subjective world, and the four functions. So you have extroverted thinking. So again, you will see the characteristics of each type. Extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing, extroverted intuiting, introverted thinking, introverted feeling, introverted sensing, and introverted intuiting. So again, each types have their own characteristics. What else? So here's another table for the different psychological types according to Jung's theory. So for introverted thinking, so they would most likely flourish in the fields of theoretical science, in inventing. Extroverted thinking people would really flourish more on being mathematicians, being accountants, being research scientists. And so this serves as a guide, as to where an individual could really flourish, or what specific field will they achieve more given their psychological types. So for feeling, introversion, subjective movie critics, art appraisers. For extroverted feeling, real estate appraisers, objective movie critics. So this is something that you can read in your book. Now let's proceed to the next concept, which is on the concept on development of personality. And so Jung also has his own concepts of personality. But let us take note, so let's really try to focus our attention on some differences between his concepts on personality development than that of Freud. For Freud, the infantile stages, the oral, anal, and phallic stages, are more important when it comes to personality development. And so, unresolved conflicts or unresolved needs or over satisfaction of needs during these stages would actually result to more or less negative or unhealthy um, personality later in the adult life. However, for Jung, it's not necessarily those early periods that are important, but it's actually middle life that is more important. And so Jung believed that personality develops through a series of stages that culminate in individuation or self realization. And so for his theory, he emphasized the, again, second half of life, which is the period after age 35 or 40. This is, again, the emphasis on the development of personality in analytical psychology. This period brings an individual an opportunity to bring together the various aspects of personality and to attain self-realization. So it's not during childhood, no, where again there may be a great potential but again less consciousness. So it's during the middle life that is great for or with a lot of opportunities to bring together the balance of the different aspects of personality, so an individual will be able to attain self-realization. So a really good illustration that Jung painted a picture in when it comes to the development of personality is one's life um, journey. So Jung liked to compare the development of personality as a trip through life to the journey of the sun through the sky, with the brightness of the sun representing consciousness. So if you would liken the childhood years as the early morning, so you would see that you would see that even if it's not yet that bright, but you would know it has a lot of potentials in reaching a period where it will be at its full brightness, and that's something during the noontime, right? So childhood is full of potential, but it still lacks in brilliance or consciousness. And as the sun goes up, climbing towards the peak of the sun, so again, this is where the potential is its greatest. But again, eventually the peak of the sun during the noontime will go to a decline. So the early afternoon sun is the middle life. Um, Even if it's brilliant, but it is actually headed towards the sunset, which is the most likely the ending of one's life. No? So the evening sun is old age, and it was once bright, but now it's markedly dimmed. One thing that we need to understand about the concepts of the development of personality, Jung warns individuals that the values, ideals, and modes of behavior that may be appropriate when we were younger. So we have maybe most of us have this concept of you only live once principle of living. So Jung argued that clinging to these values or ideals that are appropriate in childhood will not be healthy for an individual if it is applied on the second half of life, because what may be true in the morning may be lie in the afternoon or in the evening. And so values in the morning, behaviors in the morning are inappropriate for the second half of life. And what we individuals should do to be able to adjust to the second half of life is we must learn to find new meaning in our declining years of life. We cannot live YOLO in the second part of our lives. Okay, so what are the different stages of development? So there are several stages of development. So the first stage of development is childhood, and childhood has three sub-stages. So you have the anarchic phase, monarchic phase, and dualistic phase. The anarchic phase is characterized by chaotic and sporadic consciousness. So experiences enter consciousness as primitive images incapable of being accurately verbalized until the child would enter the next phase, which is the monarchic phase, which is characterized by the development of the ego and by the beginning of logical and verbal thinking. And eventually, on the last stage of childhood, which is the dualistic phase, when the ego is divided into the objective, the outside world, and the subjective, which is the child's inner world. Then comes the youth, which is the period from puberty until middle life. So youth, the period of youth is characterized by striving to gain psychic and physical independence from home, from parents, also from finding a mate, raising a family, and making a place in the world. Now, youth should be characterized as a period of increased activity. So again, this should be the ideal characteristics of young people. So increased activity, maturing sexuality, growing consciousness, and we also need to understand that we need to recognize that the youth period is a that the youth period is an era wherein problems come in. So we are now getting more independent, and so the problem-free era is gone forever. Unlike when we were childhood, we don't necessarily think of a lot of things, no, about life problems. But when we enter the period of youth, so this is when we recognize, okay, the problem-free era is gone forever. We are now faced with real life problems of finding work, finding a life partner, paying bills, and whatsoever. So it is necessary for us, class, to recognize that the problem free era is gone. Why? Because again, your values in childhood should not be applied to the youth, because what is true during childhood may be false or may not be applicable or inappropriate during this stage. So the major difficulty facing youth is to overcome the natural tendency to cling to the narrow consciousness of childhood. So if we cling to the problem-free era, the notion that we're still living in a problem-free era, it's actually impeding growth or impeding development. And this tendency can still be found in the middle and later years. No? So it's not helpful. So the desire to live in the past or in the problem-free era is called the conservative principle. So imagine a middle-aged or elderly person attempting to hold on to youthful values would actually be crippled on the second half of life, because we need to find new ways of finding meaning during the second half of life, because again, the values during the first half of life may not necessarily be true during the second half of life. And if that happens, it can handicap the capacity to achieve self realization, and it will impair the ability to establish new goals and seek new meaning to life. And thus, self realization may not be obtained. Okay, so the next period is middle life. So for Jung, life begins at 40. And this is something that we hear from maybe our parents or relatives. They try to appease themselves that even if they are already in their 40s, but life begins at 40. And this is somewhat true to Jung's theory. Again, so middle life is when an individual has a lot of potentials. So middle life begins at approximately age 35 or 40. Although middle life is characterized by a decline. No? So again, eventually they are slowly getting to the sunset, slowly getting to the old age, the last period of life. But this period is also present with a lot of potential. So again, it is still a period for potentials for individuals. Now, most adults may be unprepared to take into the afternoon step or to take it to the next level or to the next period, because they still cling on to the values, the morals of the earlier stages of life, which should not be the case. So, a reminder from Jung that we cannot live in the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. So again, new sets of finding meaning should be present in the second half of. So you may ask, how can middle life be lived to its fullest? The answer, it has something to do with how an individual lived his youth period during his um, young age, young period. So people who have lived youth by neither childish nor middle age values are well prepared to advance to middle life and live fully during that stage. So that basically means when we were younger, we are still young by the way. Now, if we live according to values of the childhood years, we are YOLO or still thinking that we're living in a problem-free era, then we are not prepared to take into the next step in middle life. Or if now we are already um, living with middle age values, then it's also not healthy, when it comes to living our middle life to the fullest. So it has to be balanced, when it comes to living your um, young adult life. And lastly is the stage of old age. So again, this is the age where people experience a diminution of consciousness. Again, consciousness is declining. So it's diminishing over time. If people fear life during the early years, they will almost certainly fear death during the later ones because death is actually a goal during the old age. And one concept that we need to understand is the concept of self realization. So, this is something that we have heard during the earlier parts of the lecture. So, self realization or psychological birth, or also called individuation. So, this is a state that is the goal of an individual. So, if the goal for Freud is for the ego to be mature enough to control the impulses of the id and the demands of the superego, and for Adler, one's goal is to achieve the final goal through either strivings of success and superior or success or superior strivings for superiority. For Jung, it's actually to achieve individuation or a state of self-realization where different elements in the psyche are balanced. Now, again, being with the collective unconscious being in the center of the psyche. So again, analytical psychology is a psychology of opposites. And self-realization is the process of integrating the opposite poles into a single homogeneous individual. And so the process of coming to selfhood means that a person has all psychological components functioning in unity with no psychic process atrophying. So what are the characteristics of self-realization? Again, it has something to do with the balance. So each of the elements in the personality system must be balanced. So characteristics of a self-realized individual, he or she minimizes the role of persona because persona is not the only side of one's personality. It's only a part of it. The person recognized anima and animus. The person is not there. The person has also is also comfortable with the shadow, no? Allowing the creativity qualities of the shadow to color the personality system. The person acquired workable balance between introversion and extroversion, and all of the elevated four functions, or all four functions, are elevated to a superior position. So this is the picture or characteristics of a self-realized individual. Now, let's try to see where analytical psychology or how analytical psychology is rated in the dimensions of humanity. So first is on the pessimism versus optimism spectrum. So Jung's theory is neither pessimistic nor optimistic. How about for determinism versus free choice? It's also neither. It's not deterministic nor necessarily lean towards free choice. For the conscious versus unconscious influences, so according to Jung, people are motivated partly by conscious images, partly from personal unconscious, and partly from our collective unconscious. So all of these elements influence or motivate individuals. On the dimension on causality versus teleological, so it's actually um, both causal and both highlighting the importance on teleology. No? How about for biological versus social determinants? So analytical psychology leans strongly towards biological influences, especially on the concepts of the archetypes. So archetypes again are inherited tendencies. Again, they are biological materials. So we inherit them from our ancestors. And on the dimension between similarities versus uniqueness, so analytical psychology is rated high on similarities among people. So the reason why it's rated high on similarities because again, Jung emphasized the role of the archetypes or the collective unconscious, which is basically the same across people from different cultures. And so Jung emphasized similarities among people rather than the differences. And so that concludes our lecture on analytical psychology. Hopefully, you learned about the concepts. And if there are still concepts that you do not understand, so feel free to ask your individual instructors. But more importantly, please have your own reading. So thank you for listening and keep safe. Bye bye.